session. So I'd like to introduce our next two speakers, Christopher Lennon, President and CEO at MediaAnswers, and Clyde Smith, who's the Senior Vice President of New Technologies at Fox Networks Engineering and Operations. They are talking about the NABA DPP specifications, standards, and content delivery. And if you think the title might sound a bit boring, I can recommend you really to stay tuned for this presentation. Welcome.
Well, that's a great introduction. We'll try not to disappoint. First of all, congratulations to everybody here for making it almost through the entire conference. So to the answer, are we there yet? Almost. So we thought when Clyde and I looked at this, it's kind of 'tis the season. I thought this was a combination of like Halloween and color bars. It kind of look like that. So of course, it's that season all the time here in Hollywood if you walk down on the boulevard, right? But one thing that's been interesting is many years ago. How many people were here when several years ago this happened up on the stage? A few? Okay, so this is several years ago, and I ever since then, I've given many talks on many different subjects, and every time I do it, people say, "Where's Bigfoot? Where's the alien?" And I'm like, well, that was years ago. Is that the only reason you come to a talk that's got my name on it? So, show of hands, is that the only reason you're in here? Well, I hate to disappoint you, but I think I have more to give, and Clyde has more to give than just that. So I'm sorry, we're not going to do a shtick with Bigfoot, with an alien. Oh, jeez. Uh-oh, I've pissed off the president of SMPTE now. I don't know. So speaking of scary things, is this the scariest topic at this conference? And I tried to put a spooky effect on here. Ooh, it's content delivery specifications. Ooh, scary. Well, it could be. It's kind of like a bad movie monster. It's this whole area, and it's almost like a three-headed monster. It's big, it's complex, it's really hard to comprehend, and it's kind of like that three-headed dragon. Is it Ghidra, something like that? Does everybody remember that? Ghidra. Jeez. Speaking of terrifying. Oh, all right.
See if we can get this right here. Chris is now going to present this for the rest of his talk. It's a serious subject, folks.
It's a serious subject, yes. It's terrifying. So have I conveyed the terror appropriately here? All right. And if that wasn't scary enough, there's a whole bunch of these monsters that we have to deal with. In all seriousness, this is actually a major problem and something that Clyde and I have been dealing with. But fear not. Who's coming to the rescue? We have some superheroes who have come to the rescue. We have the North American Broadcasters Association and the Digital Production Partnership, NABA and DPP, have come to the rescue and tried to save us from this hideous three-headed monster. And with that, I'm going to let Clyde dive into this in a little more detail, and he's welcome to put the hat on as well, if he'd like.
So what weapons will they bring to bear? NABA partnered with DPP based on their brilliant success in the transition to file-based workflows in the UK, and we thought we could leverage that, and they've been wonderful partners to work with. And the weapon of the day, the weapon of choice, is workflow automation. Now I know, I'm looking around to see who you are, and it's an impressive group that I'm facing here, and I know that you have automated your workflows and probably done it extremely well, and you wouldn't ever have made the mistake that some of us made when we went from tape to file, which was just lift and shift our workflows, and I'm sure we've done something better than that, and I'm sure you've also taken the approach of looking at your workflows on an annual basis, just like they do when they're producing cars, and you retool on a regular basis and take it. But we're going to offer you some new tools to help you in your next retooling. But let's talk about the workflow automation. You know, it has been applied in many areas for years now, right? And the areas where it's most effective are areas that are time-intensive, repetitive, resource-intensive, whether that's human resource or whether that's machine resource. How many have workflows where certain devices are nailed up, they're just stuck, and they're only used to process for this vendor, and you know, 15% of the time you use them, and the rest of the time they sit there idle, right? That's not effective implementation. And of course, you want to replace anything that's currently subject to human error. And so the benefit to workflow automation, we all know, that's why we do it, you know, it's decreased time to market, which, let's face it, we get less and less time to make our deliverables these days. Things are produced closer and closer to release. We also want to improve and maintain quality, free up those stranded resources, whether they're people that could be used for much more effective tasks at a higher level, or they're the resources that are underutilized. And of course, we're all need to reduce margins and OpEx and CapEx. So isn't cloud the answer? We've certainly heard a great deal about it, and cloud can be very useful. But if you've done that lift and shift, and you're still storing and processing multiple versions of your content and processing it multiple times, have you really solved anything? And of course, we are all under increasing pressure to handle increasing distribution needs and the complexity of many, many, many more devices with many, many, many more versions. And the creative and technical versions that are needed continue to expand, and we're all trying to do it on a lower and lower budget because margins are decreasing for many of these distribution chains as well. And so I don't have time to go into this in detail. Please read the paper. So take the PowerPoint, give it to the kids. It's their introduction to IMF, right? You can't start them too early. But read the paper. I guarantee you one thing, at least you'll get to sleep on the airplane on the way home. So, but SIPOC is one of those process improvement tools that can be used in analyzing it. You simply look at your supplier, what input they give you, what process you use, what output you create, and who the customer for that is. That's all I'll say about it, but it's described more fully in the paper. But please utilize this tool as you're thinking about it. So now let's think about 5 change drivers. So if any one of those areas changes, you need to make a change. When you think about automating, here are 5 things that you can use the next time you retool, right? So, of course, NABA DPP, we're here talking about commonly agreed to standards-based delivery specifications. Real benefits to those, and I'll talk about that in a second. Automated fulfillment of these via BXF, and Chris is going to go into great deal of detail on that, along with automated quality control, again, via BXF. And then another new tool from SMPTE is the Open Binding ID, and we'll be going into that. And then I will finish up by talking about making your automation more efficient by migrating to the interoperable master format. The problem today is right here. Everybody's got their own specification, and guess what? They're different. Some of them are incompatible with standards. Some of them are incompatible with devices. They're ambiguous at best because they're written in the English language and not machine-enabled, and they sometimes deviate from standards. And that means multiple flavors coming from producers to distributors, and guess what? You create a reject and return cycle, and we all have lived through that. But in the future, as you adopt these commonly developed and supported standards-based specifications, you get clarity, compliance, and commonality with a common file format. Chris?
This would be the handing of the baton, right? I was listening. So one thing we took great pains to do as part of this entire effort with NABA DPP is to have several groups work together and collaborate, and we think the result is way more powerful than we would have had if one of these groups had approached this problem individually. or even worse if they'd all gone in 4 different directions on this, which would have been terrible. So, you know, the full NABA DPP project, as Clyde mentioned, it began with file delivery specifications and having one for MPEG-2 air-ready masters and one for AVC air-ready masters. And a lot of great work was put into those. You know, a lot of people put a lot of effort into creating these PDFs that give a common way for people to deliver the content. The problem with that is machines don't do too well with PDFs. They're intended for people to consume. And so while having standard content delivery specifications in PDFs was a step forward from what we have, you know, in the past, where you have all kinds of different specifications floating around. At least you have some commonality there. It doesn't help when you get to the point of wanting to automate processes around it. So, you know, we said, let's not reinvent the wheel here. We took a look at what types of tools have been built in the past that could help us to achieve some automation around this. So, you know, we looked at several different things. We looked at what had been done by the DPP in the UK, lots of good work there. Looked at what could be used in BXF to leverage here in the open binding of IDs and also with the interoperable master format. So it's important to emphasize that this effort was not creating yet another standard. It was using things that were already out there, were already implemented, but using them for things that people might not have thought about before. So, you know, BXF, it's been around for a long time now. What was nice was when this whole effort came together, the BXF 5.0 initiative was already in progress. A bunch of work had already been done on that. And when the NABA folks came to us and said, how about, you know, could we do content delivery as part of this? We said, yeah, that's kind of a logical extension. BXF has always dealt with content metadata, with movement of content from point A to point B, with scheduling of that content. So it was a logical extension of a structure that was already in place. And so we were able to really fast track a lot of the work because a lot of what was needed for this already existed in BXF. One of the really cool things that happened as a result of this, so like I said, we were already in the process of doing this 5.0 effort within BXF. We were already working on a QC area, which we had some folks in the group came to us and said, wouldn't it be great if we could standardize the requests for QC tests and then the communication of the results of those tests back and do that in a standardized way so that people who are requesting those types of tests and the results back can get them from a variety of systems in a consistent manner. That was great. And we'd already started working on that, but when NABA came to us and said, hey, we've got a quality control aspect to this, we said, that's interesting. We were already working on something like that. Let's look at what you guys have with your requirements and look at this. It matches up really nicely. And then as part of that whole thing, we said, wait a minute, there's this really cool thing that the EBU's been doing. And if you haven't looked at what the EBU has done on QC, it's very cool. They've got a really nice online tool for that. They've done a ton of work. And so we contacted them and said, hey, we're working on this. Could this be complementary to that? And they said, oh, thank you. You're our savior. We were going to do schema work on this, and we didn't even know really where to get started on it. So if you guys could do the work that we were going to do already, all that much better. So I love it when a plan comes together. Everything came together. And so we were able to harmonize this. It was just a matter of great timing. So the great news is this was completed in record time. Don't let anybody tell you that SMPTE takes a long time necessarily. This was done from start to finish in less than a year. And BXF 5.0 included a ton of really important work in there. And as you can see, it's 6 documents. Got six documents either amended or written in the span of a year and approved and published, which I think was, you know, the SMPTE people deserve a big pat on the back for being able to advance that through there. So it was very encouraging to see that, and the industry needed it to be that quick, and so that was fantastic. You know, what else could BXF do? Well, it's a little bit like a set of Ginsu knives, right? It can do a whole bunch of different things. But we've already done the Air Ready Masters. That's all published. But what about UHD Air Ready Masters? Some people are looking at doing that. That could be very useful. What about library masters and expressing those in an XML form? Certainly that could be done. And then we've also talked, when you talk about the IMF area, the OPL and the CPL. Wouldn't it be great to be able to express those in a BXF type of structure in XML and be able to exchange that type of information amongst systems who might not want to touch the IMF package itself? And so, Clyde and I were talking about this. Everybody remembers the Ginsu knife commercials, right? So act now, act before midnight, contact your board member in NABA, in DPP, in SMPTE, and tell them you want this, and we might just double your order. So also from SMPTE, like I said, we weren't in the habit of trying to invent things here that already existed. A parallel effort that was going on was the OBID effort, Open Binding of IDs, which is basically taking IDers for program material and taking add IDs for non-program material, commercial material, and binding those to the content in the way that it survives through all the abuses that content goes through from the point at which it's produced to the point at which it's consumed. And so we looked at that and said, well, that actually fits in with this whole thing and really complements the effort that we're doing with content delivery specifications. Again, carrying things through from the top of the media workflow chain all the way down to the bottom. And what's amazing to me, and when I talk to people who aren't in our business, OBID, we always say that this is like having a barcode on the content. Like you were talking about, James, we used to have the actual sheet of paper with the tape. Of course, we don't have that anymore, and so there isn't really a physical barcode. But every other industry has a way of identifying what they're selling, right? And what they have in terms of a value, in terms of the equivalent of a barcode, some kind of an identifier that's embedded and can't go away. That's what OBID does, and that's really where it adds the value to this whole chain. But continuing on the Ginsu knife thing, that's not all. And we have Mr. Smith here to talk about IMF.
So many of you have sat in a number of sessions on IMF already this week, and I will apologize for the simplicity of this one in that there isn't sufficient time to drill down. But again, read the paper. There's some great stuff in there and some great detail in the paper. But you're already seeing adoption and the power of the CPL and the OPL. And there's going to be a few things that I'm going to say when we get to the OPL that are aspirational, but I assure you there's work in progress that will soon give some of that functionality. So let's get into it a little bit. And I apologize for those of you that this is overly simple for, but if you receive your first IMF package, what do you get when you open the package? Well, you open the package and you get a packing list, just like when you open any other package. And the Interoperable Master Package has a packing list, simple little XML file that, guess what? It lists all the files, all the contents, and what's there, et cetera. And it can be either incomplete, imagine that, a partial delivery, just like FedEx, or a complete delivery. You can get into the details of a complete IMP and a partial IMP. But, there's always that sub-track that should come in from Poland that's running late, or the dubs that should come in from Italy that are running late, and so you do wind up making a fair amount of partial deliveries. And also when you open it, you've got your IMP opened, you've got your packing list, and now guess what? You've got an asset map which says, hey, here's where these files are. They all seem like fairly useful tools, right? But don't become attached to them, because they're useful for one thing. They're useful in that delivery process. And as soon as you've ingested them, throw them away. Don't use them again. They were only good for that purpose of getting the package to you. Same way you throw away the box and everything that comes outside the box with FedEx. But what do you keep from the package? You keep the content. So CPLs, and I'm sure you all know by now that a CPL is a simple XML string. And it defines a timeline for playback of elements, of components to create a composition. So it's an editorial set of instructions that say, utilize these components and create a composition from it. And those components can be essence, they can be metadata, they can be graphics, etc. And then there's an OPL in there, the output profile list. So imagine now that you've created a composition and the OPL is, not the editorial content, but the technical instructions of how to render this so that it's suitable for delivery to a certain platform. So I won't dwell on this too much, but here's the essence tracks, and then you've got your CPLs. Now you create a lot of versions for a lot of reasons. You may create a version for time of day. You may create a version for a region. You may create specific cultural, regulatory, or creative needs. Maybe you're making the airline version, right? So the CPL essentially says, hey, use these elements of these components and assemble them to make a composition. In this case, it's US English. In this case, it's US Spanish. And then you could do Canadian French, director's cut, and cultural or time period appropriate. So, okay, you know all that. And just a little simpler version of it, just to point something out here. So you get the master body of the program delivered, that essence, that big video essence track. But then you can have English titles and credits to wrap around that, right? Or you can have French titles and credits. But you don't have to repeat the master body every time. So think about what that means in terms of transport, in terms of storage, and in terms of processing. This is where you're going to get some savings. So once again, you select those appropriate elements to create the versions you need. All right, so now you've got these series of compositions that were created from the CPL, and here's the little bit of aspirational part. You may have heard there are some issues with how OPLs have been implemented and with some of the features that are in OPL. So it's inconsistent across manufacturers, and the feature set isn't quite as rich. So this is aspirational, but I assure you there are people working to bring this to fruition. And you'll be seeing more about that at HPA and NAB. So here's the tech spec processing, right? Okay, so I've got the composition created. What are the technical parameters that I need in order to create a compliant version for iTunes, or Air, or VOD, or Netflix? And we all know VOD isn't even one because there's so many variations within the specification that everybody uses, right? So, there's a lot there. But don't forget one more, very important, and that is in-house proxies. How many of you make legal review copies? How many of you make screeners for sales? How many of you have to do something for a compatibility with a legacy system in-house, or have to create standards and practices versions? So don't forget the customer. In the SIPOC, you're your own customer. And don't forget about using this to serve those needs in an automated fashion. A lot of time is spent, a lot of effort spent in some organizations to create those versions. So what have we achieved by doing this? Well, automation, right? Automation. I didn't go into the details of the checksum and map verification processes, but in the article, there are 3 pages that go through this in exquisite detail, which is why you will get that sleep I was talking about. Automation of the quality control processes. We hope to extend this into BXF if we get approval from the board of NABA and DPP and others. So make that call before midnight tonight, please. And automation of version tracking, because we've got good IDs now. And we can follow it. And if you cannot measure it, you cannot manage it, and you cannot monetize it. I can't emphasize how important OBID will be to this process. And then, of course, we've optimized the verification of the receipt, and we've reduced the number of redeliveries because we're on a common standard. Remember, a common specification that we've all worked on and agreed to. And so there's less for the manufacturers to support and develop too, and it costs you less to buy it, and it costs you less to implement it. And since the metadata is delivered in band, anybody had ever lost any metadata out of band and then had to chase it down? It's delivered in band, so it's consistent and it's held together with the material. Just as James was talking about wrapping in AXF, so it's going to be beautiful to wrap IMF in AXF and have all that in-band metadata. It'll be a wonderful thing for preserving long term. So in conclusion, we have achieved the simplified content delivery specification process. We're getting towards commonality as people adopt it. We've increased the automation. We've enabled automation in QC. We've demonstrated that rapid development is very possible within SMPTE. DPP, NABA DPP has not produced any additional standards. We didn't want to invent anything new. We've selected the proper modes and options from a host of standards to utilize for this application. So we've improved automation, we've improved accuracy, and with each adoption of this specification, you're eliminating other specifications, right? So you're taking things out of the market that are costing every one of you money. When you go to buy from Telestream, think about how many they have to support for other customers. But every one you take out of the market reduces your costs, improves your accuracy.
What was that?
So that was a menacing cloud, okay? So clouds are our friends, right? That's where we started with this, wasn't it? So, but people are using them badly. Some people have done a lift and shift and moved their horrible old-fashioned workflows into the cloud. And what's the impact of that? Well, they're storing multiple full versions of content in high resolution. It's going to cost them money to make all these additional versions and store them and process them again and again and again, and then process them yet again to produce technical requirements for specific platforms, which will be wrong, and there'll be reorders, and they'll have to do it yet again. And that means excessive processing in QC, excessive storage and archiving, excessive transport, and increased costs, which we all hate. But fear not. Once again, it's NABA DPP to the rescue, but this time they've been joined by the EBU and the SMPTE all coming together to address these problems for you. And they're going to deploy their superpowers, commonly agreed to standards-based delivery specifications, and automated fulfillment of those specifications via BXF, and automated QC of the resulting files via BXF and EBU QC, and automated measurement, management, and improved monetization via OBID, and finally, efficient automated production of versions via the interoperable master format. And the end result is happy clouds and happy end users simply by deploying the superpowers. But here's the serious part of this message. Because they're now storing components and using those components to create compliant compositions efficiently and automated. They are saving, and these are numbers, folks, that we modeled first and then we verified from 3 separate implementations. I can't tell you who these are because some of these people were just a little embarrassed to say they were so inefficient in the past. But look, 20 to 80% of processing, even if you're in the cloud, processing costs money here. And 50 to 75% savings in storage and archiving, and 50 to 80% savings in transport costs. And that saves time and money and reduces cost, which we all love to do. And with that, we'll take a question. I think we got time for one question. Any questions? Mr. Kovalik.
That wasn't scary. That was enlightening. Very nice. I have a question. Who owns this? You mentioned 4 in partnership. You mentioned DPP, and you mentioned NABA. Sorry. Yeah.
NABA,
so
DPP,
where do you get the spec from, and who controls it, and who's going to modify it in the future?
Exactly. So that's a very good question. We're doing work where it's appropriate to get the work done. Okay? NABA had the sponsorship and the membership of the executives of major North American broadcasters. And if you don't get the commitment from them to adopt this and implement it, it doesn't matter what you write. And we talked to everybody, and they said, well, we think NABA is the right place to do that. DPP had already done that, and they were kind enough to share their work with us and be a partnership. So we're on the phone twice a week with DPP and the NABA TCs doing this work. And then every other week, we're on the phone with DPP again as they work on their IMF library master format, and we're working on our library master format, and EBU's working on their library master format, and so we cross-pollinate to keep in sync. And one more thing, so yes, we've got our specifications we're writing. There's work that I know SMPTE has announced that they're working with DPP to create the first ever SMPTE specification. And the first ever SMPTE specification will be a new document from SMPTE, and that will be very specifically, if you have a broadcast workflow in IMF where you're handling international exchange of content, these are the right modes and options from the list of standards that you need to apply so that you can apply this properly. That will still get wrapped either in a DPP document or a NABA document, or I don't see EBU here, but an EBU document, simply because we've got headers that are regionally business specific and trailers that are regionally business specific that we've defined to help people, but we'll all refer back to the same SMPTE specification. So does that help?
There are great people working on OPL at motion picture studios who go, wait a minute, if you junk up my OPLs with that much delivery specificity, including to customers who are going to change their specs in a few years, we know this, you're making my archive become fragile and become stale. Are you encouraging workflows where OPLs only get made just in time as the box is going out the door?
Well, I think that's the point, isn't it? That the OPL, look, there is a motion picture workflow that in some cases is similar, in some cases is different. But the strength of the SMPTE work that they did in the standards of IMF is it will encompass both. And so you may have a set of motion picture workflow OPLs that are entirely different than what you need in broadcast. And yes, in broadcast, you won't create a Netflix OPL and keep it for Netflix forever, or hopefully soon Apple will adopt IMF and will change, and Apple will have a new OPL that will produce something. Yes, unfortunately in the broadcast redistribution, after you've unified all the workflows and one group meets the same product for everybody, yes, you're going to have OPLs that evolve over time as the needs of the platforms change.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.